Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Zoom CEDLA lecture. While people are moving over from the waiting room to the main room where we are meeting, I'd like to welcome all of you. Today we are gathering here at the Zoom platform for our last CEDLA Friday afternoon lecture of this academic year, and this will also be the last one that closes off a series that we have been organizing fully online, because we will of course continue in the next season with a new series of lectures, but hopefully we can meet again at CEDLA by that time, or at least for some of those lectures. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our guests, Michael Janoschka, who will be the speaker of today, and Femke van Noorloos, who will be discussant of today. I will introduce them in more detail. First of all, my name is Christine Klauves. I will be the moderator of this afternoon. And let me explain what we'll do in the next hour. So first, we are very pleased to have with us Michael Janoschka, who will talk about contested urban territories in Latin America, financialization, displacement, and gentrification. And his lecture will capture his core knowledge of all those processes. He is a well-known colleague who publishes a lot about Latin America and with Latin American colleagues. And he has a EU-financed project on contested territories. He is a senior lecturer in the Institute of Geography at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And he will present to us his latest research findings in the next 30 to 35 minutes. Then I'll give the floor to Femke van Noorloos. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Utrecht. She works in the Department of International Development Studies, and she's also a human geographer, and with a lot of knowledge also of Latin America. While she comments on the lecture or formulates some questions to reflect upon for Michael Janoschka, you can already, as a public, also participate by putting your questions in the chat, and we will then later on open the floor for the general discussion. We will have until 5 o'clock, and at 5 we will switch to a different location where we have the possibility to meet more informally. But we will tell you about that later, because that means that you will have to click on a link that we will put in the chat. So I think these are the more general outlines of this afternoon, and I look very much forward to what Michael Janoschka is going to tell us. So Michael, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much for this for the invitation, for the introduction. I'm just share my screen. It's really an honor to be with you. And at the same time, I must admit that this conversation feels somehow a bit strange. Not because of this online format that we all got used to over the last 16 months or so, but because there's to some extent a kind of time lag between my own knowledge, my own feelings, my own experience in and about Latin America, and the real world experience of people in Latin American cities that was obviously opening up in the last 18 months due to the pandemic. I consider that it's long ago that for a year and a half or more I've not been to Latin America to go on with friendships, with research, with all the work that we've been elaborating in previous years. So this creates a very strange feeling that we talk about something that we have really been in a different shape and distance over the last year and a half. At the same time, we've all partially been learning on this. We've been carrying out research, empirical research during 2020-21 in Latin America, and this is also part of what I will present further on. So in this presentation, I want to further develop my previous work on gentrification displacement into new conceptual frameworks, and try to frame it through this notion of contested urban territories in Latin America. It's part of an intellectual effort of this project that has been mentioned already, which is named Contested Territories, an initiative funded by the European Commission that will accompany us for the next 3.5 years still. So in this presentation, I'm targeting to weave together different scenarios, different places, and places in the city, especially how developments or processes taking place in city centers relate and correspond with processes in the periphery. And this, for this, I would like to start with an introduction departing from the common grounds of Latin American urban development, which is the framework of the rapid urbanization and the housing deficit that has been stated in Latin American cities. And at the same time, a diffusion of housing policies, especially with regard to low-income housing promotion, which since the 1990s, which following the advice and influence of transnational institutions such as the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, fosters or targets a commodification also of low-income housing and the transformation of low-income housing into an investment asset. Some of the Chilean model of low-income housing applied since the late 1970s is somehow the role model for this, where the state is gradually replaced by private actors in the promotion, in the development of social housing. This leads, as you can see on the photo on the left side, to consequences of monotony and important social consequences in this new urban habitat that has been built. I appreciate this photo a lot, although I was suffering a lot when I was taking this photo, because this was in a conference in Santiago, Chile. This was a photo. I was invited for a helicopter flight, and was taking this out of the helicopter. This was probably the most, one of the moments of highest fear level that I ever had, and one of the noisiest moments also. So terrible experience, but quite good photos that I'm using again and again. So talking about the consequences of this new peripheral urbanization is obviously the rearticulation of the social structure in cities. We have this example of Santiago de Chile, and we have huge, massive social housing projects in the periphery of the metropolitan areas, and this targets also or makes a space for a rearticulation of the city center that I've been working on for many years in different cities across Latin America. So,
Michael,
yes.
Could you speak a little bit louder? Because
yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this relates in the next step also to other cities in Latin America. Yeah. We could see this photo from Santiago de Chile, also in Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, and as here we can see in Mexico City. So these are in many cities a new way of peripheral urbanization and realities that in the end look partially like this. On one hand, as in the case of Mexico City, abandoned housing, abandonment of these housing estates, and on the other hand, a whole series of rearticulation of very complex adaptation, change, and appropriation, often conflictive appropriation of the urban space that has been planned. And this is what I want to further discuss under the term of the political economy of social housing in Mexico City, and where I want to bring together, and I think this is somehow a really complex endeavor that I will not manage to achieve at all, the idea of contested urban territories, the processes of financialisation, processes of gentrification and displacement. Potentially, this is an ambition project for book publication and not for 30 minutes talk. So I will try to weave these things together in two steps. I will first talk about conceptual reflections that I want to address, about the terminology that I'm using and the experience, and that this the reading that this terminology can give us about urban space, and then look into everyday life at the peripheries in Mexico City. So I want to start about this conceptual reflections with the term of territory, which is obviously a term that bridges or shows the divides of how scientific knowledge is being controversially constructed. We have a notion of territory in broader parts of the English-speaking world, where, at least in the mainstream, it is thought as a space under the control of a group. And this group is usually the state. So we have some kind of mainstream geographies, orthodox geographies that stem out of this. While in the Spanish or Portuguese-speaking world, we're talking about the appropriation of space in political processes, which are usually counter-hegemonic, which are usually contested. So we're talking about a heterodox approach that focuses often on social movements, on political struggles of less favored groups. And as many discourses between different languages, the exchange between these perspectives is quite low, has been coming up in the last years. There's a domination or hegemony of discourses stemming from the English-speaking world, like everywhere, which we can address or think through the terminology of the coloniality of power. If we take out of this, or if we bring this forward to the conceptualization of contested urban territories, I would like to depart that we define this as an intentionally open, interpretative, and somewhat oriented concept that is oriented towards social and political processes occurring in space. It relates to practice and conflict, looking at socio-political processes with many actors that habitually respond to some kind of political organization that's less hierarchical and include locally embedded social organizations. It incorporates also insurgent production and subversive appropriation of space in and through conflict. And this conflictive perspective on space and on territories is extremely important in this aspect. So political contestation for us means here kind of process of making territories, transforming them into reality. Yeah? And out of this, I feel that there are four dimensions that could be really interesting to look at when we talk about contested urban territories. First, the question of how the territoriality of politics can be contested and is being contested. And here I'm referring to public policies, of the modes of regulation, of the process of governmentality, that somehow structure the way how our cities are being built, constructed, controlled. Secondly, it would be important to look into contesting the processes of territorial accumulation, which understand through the terms of extended urbanization, displacement, all the processes of extractivation or the exploitation of territory. Yeah? This is somehow the economic valorization of territories, which I try to develop through the notion of territorial accumulation. Thirdly, I would look through the notion of contested urban territories into how the material and symbolic production of territories is being contested, which means how inclusive habitat is being socially produced, and which kind of models of cultural, political, and social innovation from below, from popular classes can evolve. And fourthly, it's also crucial to think about to contest epistemologies, think about in these terms how to introduce reflections on alternative knowledge, what in Spanish speaking world is known as otros saberes, into a dialogue with our way of framing and discussing.
Michael,
yes?
maybe it would help if you speak a little bit closer to the microphone, because some parts are a little bit difficult to hear.
Yeah. Does it sound better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in these terms, this is a notion centered on conflict and negotiation between actors that are somehow integrated in unequal and multi-scalar power relations. It addresses existing systemic and epistemic violence of contemporary economic formations like financialisation, globalization, neoliberalization, and especially their inherent coloniality. When we talk about alternative knowledge or otros saberes, we're talking about existing but habitually marginalized approximations to values, knowledge, and relations between human beings and territories, and obviously about the discrepancies between the accepted scientific knowledge and the codes of incorporated and practiced knowledge. And this requires somehow to decode and understand the visible and invisible relations inherent to the coloniality of power, which is later on in the practice quite a challenging way, especially in these times of possibility of personal contacts with people. This as an introduction to the framing of the notion of contested urban territories. I would like to go ahead and think about how we can frame into this the processes of financialisation, displacement, and gentrification, which will take me another moment from now on. So basically, financialisation, which is important to understand what we will discuss later on through the example of the social housing in Mexico City, has been framed by people like Kostas Lapavitsas, who's Greek economist at LSE, through the term, or who says that financialization is a systemic transformation of capitalism. Epstein tells us that financialization means the increasing role of financial motives, markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of the domestic and international economies. And Greta Gribner indicates that financialization is a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. And this is crucial because these 3 points are crucial to understand, or to make us understand, that financialization is not a process that just transforms finance as a sector, but it transforms the way of how economics work, the way how governance and urban governance is being works in our societies, and also how subjectivities and the constitution of subjects in space is being done. So it has an influence on all systems and of all parts of our societies, and changes the constitution of most aspects in our life. This is why it is crucial to think about this, how it also relates to the production of contested urban territories. Stemming from previous research, I would like to make a very short introduction into the term of gentrification, which has been somehow heavily contested in intellectual thought in and about Latin America, and which we have been adopting over the last decade or so in order to demonstrate the difference of how gentrification is unfolding in Latin American cities. We've been taking it up out of the struggles against gentrification, the struggles against displacement in several Latin American cities, where social movements have been using this term. And so this made me somehow at that point confident to think about using the term also for critical urban research. So gentrification in Latin American cities differs. It's quite different to how it's framed in the Anglophone mainstream. We've been developing somehow three important roads of discussion. On one hand, we find it very important how the symbolic constitution of cities is being tackled through gentrification, and how aspects like race, ethnicity, but also tourism, gentrification, or heritage are somehow coined symbolically in a way that they follow and pursue gentrification, but also things like control mechanisms and special risks. The question of symbolic gentrification is crucial for thinking gentrification in Latin America, and it's different to the Anglophone world. The neoliberal politics of gentrification are important in the way how the state leads gentrification processes and revitalizes or aims to gentrify through revitalization processes. It is also important to think about how—
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's you. Sometimes the sound is a bit low.
It's strange. Let me just change the configuration, and I put on another microphone. Does it sound better now?
Oh yes, that's definitely better. Thank you.
I'm really sorry. Okay, so I've been what I was mentioning in the last minute or so was about the question of how gentrification is different in Latin American cities and in the English-speaking world. I tried to flesh out symbolic gentrification, neoliberal politics of gentrification, and the constitution of new real estate markets and its relation to gentrification as crucial aspects and issues in this. And this relates to this point to three violent processes, namely symbolic gentrification somehow is mirrored in the symbolic violence of displacement. Neoliberal politics of gentrification are mirrored in the violence of politics of displacement that are being implemented in Latin American cities, and the new real estate markets somehow show and demonstrate the violence of eviction of informal activities in Latin American cities. This relates to the third term, displacement, which I understand as a material or economic process on one hand, at the same time as a political process and as a symbolic process and as a process with psychological effects on the population. So these four dimensions help me to develop a scheme how to analyze and think through displacement in empirical research. As a violent process, there's a whole series. We could continue this list of seven points. The whole list of different violences that are being used to orchestrate displacement, the violence of finance and profit, the violence of media discourse, the violence of how heteronormativity and patriarchate is acting in cities, the violence of policing, of moral authority, of aesthetics and architecture. I could talk hours on this and provide further examples on this. What I feel important to stress here is
to think it that displacement as well as gentrification and financialization are violent processes that in the end carry out a kind of dispossession of different aspects. And this is what we fleshed out in our research in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, and Rio, and Santiago, and in Quito, where we tried to characterize this kind of displacement by dispossession of different aspects: architectural heritage, cultural heritage, citizenship rights, grounded dispossession, and the capital gains of public intervention into an empirical typology that takes place in all cities, but somehow where every place is an example for understanding a specific mechanism of displacement that in a violent manner transforms the city. Going back to Mexico, this is the only example that I will develop is this example of displacement by heritage accumulation, where especially in the city center, in the historic city center, somehow through the method of a mussification of the historic city center and the cleansing of public space, the colonial heritage and the architectural heritage is being extracted, public space as an asset is being extracted, applying the violence of hypersecurity, of ethnic and racial violence against people who previously inhabited and appropriated the space, and a kind of touristic violence by or for tourists that is being applied by public authorities. This helps us to understand displacement in the city center, to go back and compare displacements in the periphery, because what I try to aim by bringing together these views on gentrification, displacement, financialization under the frame of contested urban territories is this connection between the city center and the periphery. So what I want to express is that we can only, or we should bring together what is happening in this historic city center in broader parts of the city with the peripheries and the reconstruction or new construction of peripheries in a holistic way. This is what I rapidly want to address through the term of the political economy of social housing, where in the case of Mexico, peripheral urbanization or the urbanization of the peripheries of the metropolitan area has become a state policy. State policy that, following somehow conceptualization of Manuel Alves, we could frame it under the notion of a real estate complex, the financial real estate complex between the state and financialized real estate investors. It has become a state policy that has transformed the metropolitan region massively, which is directed to formal employees on lower incomes, lower middle incomes, which basically exclude half of the population of the metropolitan areas. And central actors are here two funds, Infonavit and Foviste, which retain compulsory fixed percentage of the salary of formal employees, and then concede, subsidize, and state guaranteed mortgages to people so that they can buy houses in places that are being developed. Part of this being developed in Mexico City, obviously on salary ranges or on price ranges that are inaccessible for lower income people. And much of it is being developed in the very far periphery of the metropolitan area, where people need 2 to 3 hours to commute every day to the city center if they work in Ciudad de Mexico. So somehow through the system, there is secure business for real estate companies and developers, established but guarded by the state. And for the population, it is somehow a system that really assigns you a place in the new construction of territories only on the sole criteria of your salary. Within this frame, we've been conducting interviews both in 2017 and in 2020 with people who live in two areas, which are marked here, Sumpango and Intecamak, which have somehow different, very different stories to tell us, very different developments a couple of years after having been sold to the people, but which both have a very similar approach to that. They have been branded by specific companies that have developed the major part of the whole of the developments in these neighborhoods. So we've been conducting interviews in 2017. We've revisited many people in 2020 to see how the condition has been changing. And out of this, we try to think and develop a series of 5 dispositive of somehow control. I'm not sure if control is the best word, of control that can be, or of territorial development slash state policy that is being implemented in these developments. So the first dispositive, we term it under the discourse of their own heritage, or the heritage of their own property, where people in the conversations with us stress a lot how much they valorize and give value to the question of heritage, of buying a house, buying a property, and what it gives to them for their children, for the rest of their life, of what they can accumulate in their life. So this is crucial of convincing somehow people that heritage, patrimonio in Spanish, is an important asset for buying a property. Even for people who depend on these social credits that are being provided by Fovista and Infonalit. The second aspect, which is a crucial dispositive, is about the social spatial stratification that is being implemented across the whole metropolitan area, but on people in this policy. People talk about that it is basically the only place that they could afford. They didn't want to go to they didn't want to move to these places. They would have liked to find something else, but this is the maximum that they could achieve. So many of them have been traveling around to see what they can afford and chosen the less worst condition, social spatial condition that they can access. This obviously makes a stratification of the population that is crucial for the future of the developments. The third one relates to the fallacy of what a social mortgage in this case is, where everyone talks about that even after paying 5 years, 8 years, 7 years, as in these quotes, there's no, they've basically not paid anything of their of the mortgage, but they only pay interests, and this combines then to the problems rising out of the current pandemic. But many people lost their jobs, changed their jobs, and have huge problems in approaching the payments of the mortgages. The fourth.
I'm going to interrupt you one more time to point out that there you have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. I've 2 slides about the dispositives, and then I'm closing them. We're well in time, I think. Thank you very much. The fourth dispositive that we've developed here out of our work is about the everyday life in the periphery, which is which somehow looks nice in the beginning, but really degrades in many places very rapidly, especially in the places that are far away and where there's lots of abandonment, where there's lots of dirtiness, where there's very little taking care of the public spaces, huge amounts of insecurity, and problems like the lack of infrastructure, schools, hospitals, medical centers, and so on. So everyday life in the periphery is somehow different way, and people are increasingly unsatisfied with this. And the fifth dispositive that we've been finding out is about the reality of the mortgage life in the end. So basically, where people, this is part of the updated interviews that we've been doing in 2020, somehow when that people really struggle to pay their mortgages over time. They really struggle to maintain their payments the correct way, and often have to renegotiate the mortgages, or have to, on the other side, really adopt the lifestyle, cut down in food, cut down in meat, cut down in cultural activities, cut down in everything that somehow makes life valuable life. And this somehow, this thick description of the reality through these 5 dispositives, which for me demonstrates how new urban territories are being constructed. And now the next step for me would be to look at what kind of contestation arises out of this, and how this perceives, or how this changes the proper production of space. You've seen previously that that there are many abandoned houses, that there's a lot of things going on, and a very interesting way to look on how somehow social life is rediscovered and elaborated through contestation. This goes back to thinking about how we can think these empirical results and this empirical analysis through the lens of contested urban territories. And I repeat this slide that we had at some point in the beginning, where we can think about how people through daily life and through daily activities contest the territoriality of politics, and the way how through public policies and modes of regulation specific places are being constructed. We can look on how they may be able to contest the processes of territorial accumulation and somehow the exploitation of places like these in the periphery of Mexico City. We could think about how they contest the material and symbolic production of territories, and aim at try to produce socially inclusive habitat in places that are not thought for this, and how they innovate from below. I think the fourth point is really difficult in this case, to think how we can introduce their knowledge into our approach to work from a conceptual standpoint on the construction of urban space in the periphery of Mexico City. So this is very much work in progress at this stage, and so I really appreciate comments that somehow make us further think in our approximation, and make us further develop the connections that I'm sure are still lacking at this stage and in this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you so much for your rich analysis. So many lines of thought here. Very impressive framework. Meanwhile, while we are thinking of questions, you can already put your questions in the chat. And I now give the floor to Femke van Noorloos to reflect on the presentation of Michael.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Yes, thank you, Michael. Wow, like Christine says, really a rich, elaborate work where you bring like so many lines together of your previous and current research, which makes it quite yeah, ambitious to bring together also all these concepts and look at the inner city processes and the peripheral processes, the different types of housing. So yeah, it's quite challenging for me to comment on, and actually I have probably way too many questions, so the challenge is limiting it to maybe 2 or so. So let me start with one question. Well, currently I'm myself really interested in the issues of low income but incremental housing, what you probably would put under inclusive habitat making from below. And by coincidence, we've presented about this on Mexico City also at LASA. So I wanted to ask you if you could reflect a bit on this issue of self-help approaches or incremental housing approaches, which have also been included in the law in Mexico, in political processes. So they are being kind of formalized, you could say. So how do you see these interconnections between the inclusive habitat creation from below versus the top-down governance processes? Does it then also run a risk of financialization, for example? And yeah, how do you see these links? I would love to hear more about that. Let me see what, well, then I would maybe ask another question about your work on gentrification, because I really indeed in one of our articles also with Christine, we're also looking a bit into how to see gentrification, displacement, and how to make a typology for that in relation to urban land grab we did actually. But so I'm really wondering, like, yeah, how can we still use the term without making it too broad, or like, is it still used for yeah, for a clearly definable process, or should we start also thinking using other terms? Well, you talk about the contestation of territory, etc., but also I guess the CEDLA would really like also to talk about the urban commons, the enclosure of the urban commons, the commodification of the urban commons, you could call it, or you could talk about segregation. So there are so many concepts that academically, but also for activists or for social movements that they could use. So do you still think gentrification is useful for all these different processes academically, but also maybe for activism and for resistance? Maybe I'll just leave it at these, because I'm sure a lot of people also have questions.
Michael, do you want to respond to Femke? And meanwhile, I look at what others have to ask from the public.
Yeah, I start with a second point, which is obviously a crucial aspect. And I remember I've been criticized a lot from different sides by using the term of gentrification, and it's obviously tricky. We initially started to use work with a framework of gentrification because we wanted to decenter notions from this somehow this mainstream Anglophone discourse, and we run somehow into an active use of this, especially in with Movimiento Pobladores in Santiago de Chile, were really very much supportive in discussing and at the same time strongly adopting the framework of gentrification for their own political purposes. So I would take from this experience some years later some of the call of thinking through conceptual frameworks with a local with a local need or with a local use. In the term of if it helps people to call a process gentrification, then I feel it makes sense to develop and use this. If it helps for people in their struggles, in their contestation, to work with the terms of los comunes, the commons, or extractivism or whatever, it makes sense to do this. If people don't refer to this, then we become detached from their realities. Somehow, what I'm trying to further bring forward in this is this notion of territorial accumulation, where I try to bring together something that goes beyond looking at specific places, like in most of the gentrification and displacement literature, and think the city and even the extended urbanization processes as a holistic way where we not only destroy the planet, but we also destroy the livelihood of people. And for this, I'm trying to work through the term of territorial accumulation as a meaningful notion that might help us to make us understand how this accumulation works through, in, and across territories. Regarding the other question of incremental housing, probably your own work on the policies is much more updated than mine. The interesting aspect for me in looking into social housing or low income housing in the case of Mexico City is really this massive process of a state policy that financializes, that supports, that is able to construct a new reality and a new whole business model on which big construction companies were first somehow constituted, then they were able to exploit territories and people, and at some point some of them went bankrupt, and upon a change of policy when the expansion was somehow stopped. So this is really interesting to look into. And the other point is on incremental housing, if I understand the English term correct here when we're discussing about this, is somehow the whole series of processes how to adapt these houses which are not appropriate for people. No? If they get a house of 40, 50 square meters, this is not a house that is appropriate for making a life in this. And that is important to have the means and the possibility to modify, to change, not only if you have enough money to do it, but also if you're on the lower strata that are struggling with paying the mortgages in daily life. And you can see these differences in different areas. For example, the research which we've done in Los Héroes de Carnac, which is much closer to the city center, a bit older also, where the consolidation process and the transformation and the production of a much more livable habitat has gone much farther than in places where 1/3 of the houses have been abandoned, where people moved out, where people don't pay their mortgages, where there's no markets, where there's no infrastructure, and really a very tough place that requires lots of individual strategies to make the life livable somehow. Very similar. We've been doing research also in the last year in Ecuador on the transformation or on how the whole housing reconstruction processes that were done after the 2016 earthquake have produced very serious social problems on one hand, and we're looking in how we can accompany people in these places to readapt and accompany local governments on preventing them from, in the case of make an inclusive pre-planning for the case of a new disaster that might come up in the future, where in the same way we think about how can this question of incremental housing be part of a response to a disaster in this case, if we know that people have to expand their houses because in the conditions that houses are being delivered, it's impossible that they can really live there for a long time.
Okay, thank you very much for reflecting upon Femke's questions and comments. There are some questions from the audience in the chat, and I think it might be nice because we're discussing, you just briefly mentioned the example from Ecuador in response to the earthquake, but a very obvious question, which is also put in the chat, is of course, what do you think will be the outcome of the many current crises that are affecting Latin America, the COVID-19 crisis, but also of course elections. There are election rounds these days in several countries. What will that do to how do you interpret what is going on in Latin America right now for your analysis of a contested urban space?
It's not an easy question. This is exactly the problematic of being far away somehow, no? For such a long time that it's difficult to maintain an overview and an in-depth everyday relations with your friends and colleagues across the globe. As time passes by, and we all have our daily struggles. Yeah,
but could it be
the way how I perceive the situation is rather complicated in terms of how.
But could it also have an advantage in the sense that, for example, when you were discussing the city centers, which are overruled by mass tourism, there's much less mass tourism. Could that be an advantage in some way? Would that be possible that it counters the displacement or the focus on heritage, etc.?
I rather have a quite pessimistic viewpoint on how the COVID-19 crisis affects Latin American cities and Latin America in general. We see very strongly that states in Latin America do not have the financial capacity to respond as we see the responses in Europe, to maintain people at home, to maintain people without, when they lose their jobs, in the same way. The financial situation is worsening, and the political windows for change are very slow, very small. Taking into consideration that any change would need additional funding. And at the same time, while social organization is being to some kind more difficult than before everywhere, because it's more difficult to meet, to organize yourself. The capitalist exploitation is going on and on. So extractivism is obviously going on in the same way in 2020 and 2021 than it was in the years before, while the social capacity to respond and to counteract has been significantly damaged. No? So I don't have too much positive reading on this. Yes, temporarily tourism has gone away, but to be honest, we'll see in the long run a return to what we've had pre-2020 very quickly.
Okay.
At least in the feeling that we see now, that our economies in Europe are opening. So, people have not taken up the sustainability of not traveling as something positive. Everyone wants to leave the house again.
Let's use these last 5 minutes to ask the more concrete questions that appeared in the chat. There's one from Henri Maton.